Hi, everybody. All right. So yeah, as Cooper and Mike just talked about in part one, we're going to get into the second part of this today, where we're going to get into a bit more about the data exfiltration, where these devices were located in the world, and the types of data they were sending out, but also how we're able to get access to that data, which led us to a lot of the interesting discoveries we had with Dark Caracal. We'll discuss more about the infrastructure and the identities, and then we'll go really deep into the attribution section, which I think you guys are really going to enjoy, about the types of data you collect in your malware and why it's important not to use your testing infrastructure on production. So let's dive in. Device location and data exfiltration. So when you get a malware sample, you want to know sometimes, well, who's infected? Where is this data coming from? And that was one of the questions we asked ourselves as well. Luckily, though, in the malware, there was a C2 server that was hard-coded. It was encoded, but once we decoded it, we knew what the server was. And in this case, it was the adobeair.net domain. When we went and scanned the server, we noticed that it had the Apache status page publicly exposed. So what that enabled us to do was to go in and essentially track in real time as devices were connecting, where they were connecting from, and the types of data that they were uploading. And additionally, we also learned different types of folders where they were uploading to. So things like old B, WP9, there was a series of WP numbers folders there. And as we'll get into, is that enabled us to actually be able to access that data because it was all sitting on a publicly accessible server with directory listings enabled, actually. So that was actually very handy from an analysis perspective. So as we said, we looked at the devices, where they were coming from and communicating from, and we basically were able to come up with this map. There's a large presence, obviously, in the Middle East, which we'll get to why that's important based on where the actor's from. But there also was just about 20+ countries where devices were communicating from, including the United States, Canada, and all across the world, essentially like that. So the data that was grabbed and collected. We talked a bit about desktop and we talked a bit about mobile pieces. So what we did notice was we have at least 80+ gigabytes of data that we're able to pull down from that single C2 server. We believe that there were other portions of the C2 server that were locked down properly, so we only have a small portion of the data from that one server, and there were other servers as well that were not accessible like this. But from what we were able to glean in is that more than half of the data there was Android-based data, showing that this actor that had started on desktop had started to transition to mobile and has made it essentially almost their primary data collection vehicle. Now, what's not shown in this graph, and which is important to note, is that while the Windows is only about 19% off where the Android piece is, there were far fewer desktop clients that were infected. Just the reason there's a lot more Windows data is because it was very noisy malware, which would take a screenshot of your desktop every 30 seconds, which was interesting to learn how someone uses a computer throughout the entire day of their life. But primarily Android was their main component where they were collecting all this data from. What types of data was that? Just about everything surveillanceware is going to go after, but primary things that you'd want to get access to, the SMS messaging, call records, contacts. They wanted to get and grab whatever they possibly could off of the phone and off of your desktop. Essentially they probably had specific reasons they wanted this data for, but also for anything else that they might want to use later on, right? So they would pull any sort of file or picture that would be on your shared storage on the phone that you would expect surveillanceware to go after, but that would include personal photos, but it would also include things like legal and corporate documents as well that we discovered. And in some cases, especially if it was a Trojanized version of the app, they would upload the WhatsApp and Telegram and Skype databases that were in from those applications, and then they uploaded the encryption keys as well so that they could go ahead and decrypt them as well after the fact, after it all been exfiltrated to the server. Other types of data that we were able to discover across a number of different C2 servers. Obviously, there was a lot of desktop screenshots of users using their machines. A lot of Skype logs and databases that were collected, which includes, obviously, the databases from conversations that had happened, conversations that had been deleted, and all the different accounts that were involved and used on the Skype, as well as a number of personal photos as well, as you would expect to kind of just incidentally get collected up in this type of exfiltration that happens. And in one case, it's important to note that while we didn't see any sort of iOS malware or anything like that targeting iPhones, because this was, the desktop was infected, it was able to grab at least one instance of an iPhone backup from the phone, from the desktop, actually. And what's interesting is that backup was not actually encrypted. So had that backup been encrypted, on the desktop, it would not have been readable, but because the user had made a backup of the iPhone that was unencrypted, all that data is essentially viewable, something to consider as you store other data on your machines. As well as there was a number of corporate and legal documents as well that we came across in the exfiltration. Now, from the mobile side, this is just a sample of some of the messaging that we saw that seemed kind of interesting. So a lot of things that you would expect, like financial transactions, account information, all being done through SMS, giving you alerts that deposits have been made or that you have received a payment, including account information and the amounts and values that were there. We also had instances of shipping notifications sent to the infected phones. And some of these links were actually still active. So you could go through and see actually where the package is either coming from or going to, learning more about the intended victim or in either case that was going on as well. So that was interesting. And as well as there's a number of one-time passwords and two-factor authorization codes that were collected as well within the text messaging communications as well, proving that SMS is a very bad thing to use for things that you want to keep secret. And so just to break down the mobile data a little bit more specifically, there was a lot of data here in the short while that we looked at it. So there was at least almost 500,000 SMS text messages that were collected and just grabbed. The key point showing that the malware just kind of is very grabby. It'll go after whatever it can possibly and just upload it to the server. And the other interesting thing, as we talked about earlier, is the unique Wi-Fi SSIDs, almost 250,000 of those that were collected, and we'll talk about why those are significant shortly. And to talk a little bit about the infrastructure. So this highlighted the number of different types of C2 servers and domains that we came across that we related and linked to Dark Caracal. The primary one being adobeair.net, which we're going to get into in a second. But also we had things like securityandroid.info, which was the watering hole in the black market app store, as well as other sorts of phishing URLs that were used to host phishing sites. So things like tweets FB, FB articles, as well as a number of other domains that we actually were able to link together that Eva will talk about with the identity section, but whois information is very helpful for these sorts of things. So with adobeair.net, we noticed when we were profiling it that it was very unique. It had a very specific set of services on its system that enabled us to fingerprint, essentially. And what those services was essentially, they were using XAMPP that was set up. And this kind of leads us to believe a lot about this actor, that they were kind of using kind of off-the-shelf C2 servers, like, do you want to set up your server? Do you want to go ahead and just point and click and go? And that's what we found on a lot of the systems. They were all set up with a very specific set of Apache, OpenSSL, MariaDB, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And all the servers had this same profile. So that let us essentially narrow the haystack down as we were looking through all these different IPs and information. One thing I didn't mention is that almost entirely all of the C2 servers were hosted by a provider called Shinjiru, which is colloquially known as bulletproof hosting. So you can kind of get away with more stuff than you normally would get away with on a normal hosting provider. So they had used that as their primary one, and they had transitioned to another one at some point, but that was their primary mechanism that we were scanning for and looking for these different servers there. And so also talking about infrastructure, they had a number of different Facebook groups set up. And the primary reason for the Facebook groups, and they went by this nanis #, with the number replaced the # in. But these groups were used basically to phish users into getting to the watering hole securityandroid.info, which we have a link up at the top there, and getting them to go and download the malware, infect themselves, and go forward. So we had several different pages of these as well that we work with Facebook to essentially get taken down and alert them to these things going on there as well. And then to kind of wrap up some of the phishing sites, these were the things that we discovered on Tweets FB, so one-for-one replications of Twitter at the time, imagery and everything like that, which they would go and phish the credentials for the accounts like that, as well as the same thing for Facebook as well that we discovered on the server as well. And then finally, once again, using kind of all these signals, we threw some of them into VirusTotal to see if there was anything that we had missed. And there was a few other different services at the time that were no longer operating, but that had linked back to this infrastructure at one point or another for another type of phishing, other different types of phishing exercises as well. Now, what was interesting to note was that once we did come across these servers, we noticed that a researcher had actually already come across them and had sinkholed them. So that was good actually to see as well. But these were also other domains that had linked into the system. And with that, actually, I'm going to hand this over to Eva to talk a little bit about identities.
All right. So at this point, you may be asking yourself, who the hell are these people? What are they doing? And I'm here to answer some of those questions. So Dark Caracal used a number of different identities. The infrastructure was used with many personas. We started with the op13.mail.com email address, which was sort of key to linking a lot of the infrastructure together. And the personas which were being used by Dark Caracal were all sort of Middle Eastern names. They were Nancy Razouk, Hassan Ward, Hadi Mazeh, and Rami Jabbar. So let's talk a little bit about Nancy Razouk and Hassan Ward. What's particularly interesting about Nancy Razouk is that this is a very distinctive name, this sort of Western name combined with an Arabic name. And it turns out that this is the name of a journalist based out of Beirut. Obviously, we don't think that the actor behind Dark Caracal is actually Nancy Razouk. Though there is a fabulous picture of her hanging out with the head of an organization that comes into play later in this talk. So Nancy's name was used with the op13.mail.com in the whois information. So the first thing we do, we look up the whois information for our various domains. The name was used in the signer content for the Windows malware, this malware by Nancy Razouk. The phone number in the exfiltrated content also used the name Hassan Ward. What's particularly interesting about the phone number that was used in the exfiltrated content is that this is a legitimate Lebanese phone number. It is, however, not in any way related to Dark Caracal, and the guy who picks up the phone is really tired of hearing from security researchers, so don't call him. So let's talk a little bit about Hadi Mazeh. So Hadi Mazeh was connected to op13 and then to a bunch of the other domains that we saw that were associated with Dark Caracal, which you can see up here. So that includes twitterservices.org, facebookservices.org, arabpublisherslb.com, which again gives us sort of a clue as to who they're targeting. You're in the Arab world. What starts with an LB? We're slowly getting there. And finally, Rami Jabbar. So Rami Jabbar registered the domain arablivenews.com. Again, we're getting closer and closer. Who here is interested in targeting people in the Arab world? The whois information for these are in close proximity to where we saw the test devices, which brings us to our next section. Now, I'm really glad I get to do this part because I think this is actually the most clever part of this research. This is my favorite bit. So, you may ask yourself, where in the world are these people? Usually when you're tracking a threat actor, you can get a general idea of who they're after, and you can draw some conclusions about the country that they are from or the government that they represent based on that. But in the case of Dark Caracal, we managed to get our actors down to a building, and a floor, and a room. And it all starts with the admin console logins. So we exfiltrate all the data because they left their CNCs wide open. And while we were laughing, the first thing that we did was we went and looked to see who's logging into the admin console, because that might give us some idea of who the administrators are. We're looking all around the world, and we're sort of in the Middle East, and we're kind of near Israel, and nope, we're in Beirut. So here we are. The IP address is somewhere in Beirut. We think near the National Museum of Beirut. Now, the way that we narrow it down from here is we bust out Maltego. And we made a graph of all of the infected devices and their collected associated Wi-Fi networks. So what you see here is a large circle representing infected devices and another smaller circle. What's that? Testing devices. So here we have our testing devices circle, and it's composed of device IDs, SSIDs, and MAC addresses. Every one of these things is a testing device. We're pretty sure that they're testing devices because they don't have any other data on them. Just a couple of selfies of the administrators. We've seen a lot of nostrils. So the SSID that all of these testing devices are connecting to is BLD3F6, which we're pretty sure means building 3, floor 6. Now that narrows it down a little. So we go ahead and we take a look at the GPS coordinates that are associated with all of the test devices. And this gets us to a street in Beirut. So you can see all of the devices plotted out over the street. You can see that it is, in fact, close to the National Museum. But it's not like all of these dots are sitting on top of a building, because they're not. And GPS is, honestly, not that accurate, as anybody who has ever tried to get directions with spotty internet has experienced. So we sent someone to Beirut. We sent them to go wander around this area and look for the BLD3F6 Wi-Fi. And we found it. Unsurprisingly, in a building with at least 6 floors, in an area with not a lot of tall buildings. And guess where it was? Right here. Over by the National Museum, next to the campus of the French Lebanese University, is a large orange building with more than 6 floors. And in case you have any questions about who is in this building, it came labeled in Arabic, but labeled, big letters right across the top. And you know what it says? GDGS. The General Directorate of the General Security Services of Lebanon in Beirut. So we're pretty sure that whoever this is, they're coming from inside this GDGS building. So I'm not going to tell you who the actor is, but I'm going to tell you that the call is coming from inside the house. So what conclusions can we reach from this? Things get weird. The first is, so what the hell is Dark Caracal? It's a long-term offensive cyber campaign with global scope and scale. They've stolen more than 100 gig of data that we have found from over 600 mobile devices in more than 21 countries across thousands of victims. They're multi-platform. Primarily, they're interested in Android, but they also target Windows, Linux, OS X, and of course, the occasional Solaris administrator. Who is this threat actor? This is where things get weird. Because in order to explain the results that we have seen, this overlap between the administration of Operation Manual and the administration of Dark Caracal, we're seeing an entirely new way for nation states to go about spying. Usually, the way that you can figure out what nation state you're looking at is by looking at their targeting. You say, who wants to target all of these people who have pissed off the government of Kazakhstan? Probably the government of Kazakhstan. Who wants to target all of these people in Lebanon? I don't know. And furthermore, why would some guy sitting on the 6th floor in the GDGS building be interested in spying on people who are interesting to the government of Kazakhstan? And the conclusion that we have drawn is that there is a single actor who is renting out the infrastructure to different nation states. So if you think that nation-state spying was cheap before, when people are running around buying, premium software like Finfisher, which we can see this actor has definitely been doing, you can see that we've managed to find a way to make spying for nation states even stupider, easier, and cheaper. Great. Mobile is their primary attack vector. This is because there's just so much information that you want on people's mobile devices. You can see all their selfies. Also, they have conveniently decided to walk around with tracking devices in their pockets, and they're constantly having conversations that may be of interest to you in the course of espionage. Dark Caracal has also been able to hide inside the noise of misattribution for years. And I am saying this as somebody who misattributed Dark Caracal as recently as the year before last. One of the reasons why it was so easy to misattribute them was that they were going after multiple nation states and they looked like various actors. This is the sort of behavior that you normally see in cybercrime. These are criminals doing crime, and because their targets are so diverse, it can be really hard to pick them out of the noise. And finally, to reiterate, the Operation Manual and Dark Caracal, people are not the same actors. We've got two different actors using the same infrastructure, which again is pretty weird and novel as far as we're concerned.
One's live.
One extra minute. All right. So the GDGS, when they were confronted with our report, started out by saying, no, it's totally not us. We wish we had these kind of capabilities. And then they said, well, we wish we had these kind of capabilities. And then finally they said, oh yeah, it was totally us. And also what we did is hella legal. So that happened. And finally, the Wi-Fi SSIDs were taken down, so if you should find yourself wandering through Beirut near the National Museum, you will not be finding Building 3, Floor 6. If you would like to see references, these are the URLs. And thank you very much.